Bonus episode of the Missing Episodes podcast. When Paul Scoones agreed to have a chat with us, Paul Morris and I didn't want to pass up the opportunity to have a natter about not only The Lion, but also Paul's involvement in many aspects of Doctor Who fandom over the years. We had such an interesting discussion covering so many aspects of the show and Paul's involvement in it that we felt you might enjoy listening to the whole conversation too. Thanks so much to Paul for putting up with us, and here is our full discussion to include more content regarding The Lion. So now we're joined by Paul Scoones, who is the former president of the New Zealand Doctor Who fan club for 20 years, former editor of the Time Space Visualizer fanzine, author of the comic strip Companions 1 and 2. He also appeared on the Strip for Action DVD extra. He's author of various DVD production subtitles and Blu-ray. He's done Blu-ray production subtitles for Earthshock, co-authored on Trial of the Time Lord and Battlefield. He's author of the hardest fan novelizations on the planet to get hold of, Resurrection of the Daleks and Shada. I'll talk to you about that in a minute, Paul. He appeared on the Lost in Time DVD. And he also has helped to find an episode of Doctor Who. How are you, Paul?
I'm good. I do apologise for that very long list of things to talk about there.
Well, we'll get to The Lion last. I want to tell you about the Resurrection of the Daleks and Shada. I decided a few years ago to set out and try and buy every printing of every Target novel.
Oh my goodness.
So I got to about 750. So you get the first edition and then the second edition and then all the impressions after that. And
is this the hardbacks as well?
Hardbacks later. Right. I swapped to hardbacks, but I sort of gave up. One of the four books that made me give up was your two fan novelizations, even though they weren't Targets. I still couldn't get original copies. John Preddle's Revelation of the Daleks, and then somebody, after I thought I'd got a near complete set of Targets, someone found another printing, and I thought this is never going to end. But that was my first encounter with you. Actually, you popped up on a conversation somewhere spouting print run numbers for Target books, and then you popped up on Twitter the other day citing word count numbers for Target books. Is there anything you don't do, Paul?
Just talking about those novelizations, they are very old now. Obviously, now we have official novelizations for all of those stories, so they've kind of become a bit, even though as you say they're hard to find, they've become a bit redundant because the official versions are out there. The embarrassing thing for me is when Resurrection of the Daleks was published, the number of people who were commenting in their reviews that they preferred my version to Eric Saywood, who's the official author, for goodness sake. If anyone's got a right to novelise a story, it's him. So that was kind of a bit
From what I've heard of it, I'm not surprised. Have you heard it? Have you read it?
I have read it, yes.
Right, yeah. and I assume you're going to stay diplomatically quiet.
Diplomacy prevents me from offering an opinion on it.
He's read the lesser copy, Paul Morris. Do you have a drawer full of spares?
No, unfortunately I don't, and if I said I did, I'm sure I'd be inundated with messages. No, unfortunately they all sold out years ago, and as you're probably aware, they're all up on the website to read totally free of charge online. The reason I took them out of print was twofold. One of the copyright holders, and I'm not going to say who, contacted me and said, hey, I'm not happy about this. The reason that he wasn't happy was not that we had novelized them or were selling them. It was the fact that people were buying them from us and reselling them on eBay for astronomical amounts of money. He felt that wasn't on. And that therefore that there was a huge amount of money being made out of something that he wasn't getting any dime for. The fact that we were selling them at cost as fanzines wasn't an issue for him. So just to placate the whole issue, I just basically took them out of production so that none of these eBay profiteers could make a cent out of them. The second issue was that I started to see copies turning up which were not my printings. So people were actually pirating them and doing them as their own publications, and in some cases taking my name off the cover and putting their own one on, even though it was actually my writing. So wasn't too happy about that.
Is that what Eric did?
No. No. This was a guy who again, I don't remember his name, and I probably shouldn't say who it was, but there was when I got to the bottom of it, he was a fairly notorious sort of counterfeiter in Doctor Who fandom circles. So yeah, a lot of people came forward to say yes, he's done that to me too. So yeah.
Wow, what people get up to in this fandom.
I know, but that's what scarcity does to things.
I know Paul wants to talk to you about the comic strip companions, but tell us about the DVD production subtitles. How do you get into that?
Well, that comes about through doing the fanzine, because Martin Wiggins, who's the editor of the production information subtitles feature on the DVDs and now the Blu-rays, he took over in about 2008 and decided that he wanted to put together a pool of about 6 or 7 contributors who were all going to, because obviously the workload was far too high for him to do them all himself, so he wanted to get a number of people involved. And Martin was one of the readers of my fanzine, Time Space Visualizer, because I had a very large overseas readership on this fanzine, even though we were producing it in New Zealand. And Martin would correspond with me every so often to say, he got the latest issue, or he liked this article, or had I considered this. So we had, we were chatting on email every so often. And so one day he emailed me out of the blue and said, how would I feel about trying out for the production information subtitles and writing those? And first reaction was, he's emailed the wrong person, because I just didn't think that would be something that would be, that I would be necessarily geared up to do, or that I'd have the ability to do it. But no, Martin was quite insistent that he'd read my articles in TSV and he wanted me to try out for it. So he gave me Plan to Fire to do. And he was obviously happy with that, because he just kept firing them at me ever since then. So I did 8 stories for the DVD range, mostly Peter Davison's, but also some other 80s stories. And they were a mixture of new stories and special edition stories, because when they did the special editions on DVD, like for Vengeance on Varos and Resurrection of the Daleks, they did a new set of production information subtitles for those, because the original set had been done at a time when they weren't putting as much detail into them, and they didn't have access to the original Caversham production documents that you see on the Blu-rays now. So because we had so much more information available to us, it made sense to completely rewrite the subtitles from scratch. So I did a lot of those special editions as well.
How long would it take, start to finish, to do? You sit down, you're going to watch Battlefield.
Yeah.
You're going to do the production subtitles for it. How long does that process take, from researching to planning out to publishing it on the video? How long does that take you?
It's hard to say in total number of hours, but I usually allow myself about 2 months per story, which is but that I hasten to add, that's doing a few hours a day. That's not a 9 to 5 job. That's say do 2 hours in the morning and 1 in the afternoon or something. The quickest I've ever turned one around has been about 3 or 4 weeks, and when there was obviously a deadline to meet and I really had to pull finger. So I can do it that quickly if I just put my mind to it. But it is a lot of work.
So much work.
You got to bear in mind that the methodology is that you don't want to introduce any misconceptions or fan myths into it. You want to have it as accurate as possible. So what that means is that you are ignoring all the reference books. You're not looking at sort of all the books have been written about the stories, and I've got shelf loads of these things. You're actually going back to the original scripts and the original production documentation, and you are forming your own facts based on what's there. So what that tends to throw up is you find out new things that people have overlooked, but you also find out things that have been introduced into the belief about the story that isn't actually true, or can't be substantiated, shall we say. A classic example of this is Resurrection of the Daleks, which is one of the stories I did. For years people have said the working title for it is Warhead.
Yep, I remember.
And there is no reference to that anywhere. There's a very comprehensive production documentation going right back to when it was originally the final story of season 20. As you're probably aware, that was cancelled and then it was redone for season 21. It goes from one day being called The Return to the next day being called Resurrection of the Daleks. And the only And the only substantiated reference to Warhead I can find is someone who worked at the BBC saw it on J&T's whiteboard. Now, this is also at a time when J&T was writing things like The Doctor's Wife on his whiteboard to put people off the scent. J&T has actually said this in interviews that that's what he was doing. He put up fake titles to throw the fans off the scent because he was annoyed that stuff was appearing in fanzines before he had announced it. So the fact that Warhead appears on a whiteboard in his office, to me, is not enough fact for that being an official title.
Sure.
Yeah.
And what are you working on now, Paul?
I'm working on a story. Because I have to be quite careful about this because ones that have not been released yet, I'm obviously not able to talk about. So I am under NDA until such thing as the announcement comes out. So just bear in mind that I do have scripts in front of me and I am busy working on one.
I'll have to put in the blurb for this episode. Paul Scoones discusses the story that he's working on for the next Blu-ray release, just to get a few listeners.
Yes.
On top of all of that, you're also the world authority on Doctor Who comic strips. How did that come about? Did you just spot a gap in the market when you came to write your guidebook on the subject? Or?
Absolutely. I mentioned I used to edit the fanzine Time Space Visualizer, and my original idea was, when I was the editor, I was always looking around for ideas for articles, and I thought, well, it'd be a good idea to do a article about the comic strips. And so in starting to research that, I realised it was a huge untapped potential of information, and I'm going, well, this is a series of articles, now it's a book, now it's a series of books, because it's an enormous topic. There's as much to say about the comic strips almost as it's about the television series, because it's been running almost as long. So I just recently at the time interviewed David J. Howe and Stephen James Walker, who run Telos in the UK. They publish a number of Doctor Who guidebooks, so to me a comic strip guidebook was a perfect fit to go alongside their television companion, hence why I called it the comic strip companions, as simply as that. And I pitched the idea to them in a very informal sense. I just said, have you thought of, not even putting my name forward, I sort of said to them, have you thought of doing one on the comic strips? And they said, basically, well, that's a really good idea. Do you have any ideas for it? And so I put a sample chapter together and sent it to them, and they said, well, really like this, would you want to write the rest of the book? And I go, it's going to be a series of books. Go, that's fine by us. So it was quite an informal process, really. I just sort of thought, it went from someone should do this to I should do this in a very sort of short space of time. And it just so happened that the offer to do the comic strip companion came about in early 2008, which is exactly the same time that Martin Wiggins emailed me about doing the production subtitles. And almost in the same week, I was called into a meeting in the job that I've been working in for 7 years and told we'll be making you redundant. And I was kind of like going, this is just a sign, isn't it? So I go, okay, I'm going to be a freelance writer now. So yeah, and the first volume of the comic strip companion came out in 2012, I think it was. And that covers the what I call the poly-style era, that everything prior to Doctor Who Weekly coming into existence in 79. Yeah. And the much delayed second volume is nearing completion, and it's simply because I've had so much a big workload on other things such as the Blu-rays that I have to unfortunately keep putting it aside, but it is getting close.
Is that going to bring us up to date? Or
no, that's going to be another volume, approximately the same size as the first volume, but that only covers up to 1990. So wow, because it's just you don't want to make the book so unmanageably long. You know what I mean? So yeah, there will be a third volume to cover up to the end of the McGann era, and then I don't know. I'll just keep going until I either run out of patience or get up to date, one or the other.
It's going to expand again, isn't it? Once you get into the era when we've got Titan and the Doctor Who Adventures comic and all that.
That's a scary prospect for me, because once Tennant comes on the scene, it just explodes. There are just so many comic strips. So yeah, you could almost probably do an entire volume just on Tennant alone.
Well, I'm looking forward to volume 2. So it's nearing the light at the end of the pipeline, is it?
I hope so. I keep thinking, oh yes, I've got time now, I'll do this, and then another commission will come along and I have to put it aside again. So, and my wife and I run a comic sci-fi collectibles store as well, so between us owning and managing that takes up a lot of time as well. So,
did you already have a complete collection of all the comic strips before you started?
No, I didn't. The way that came about was that I was searching on Google for something Doctor Who related, and one of the search terms that came up that caught my eye was a Yahoo group, as they were back then. I don't know if Yahoo groups still exist, but back then there was a Yahoo group community for Doctor Who comic strips. And I've always loved the Doctor Who comic strips, so I thought, oh, this is good, I should join these guys. So I clicked into it and sent a membership request, which was duly accepted. And what I found out is that these were all collectors who were collecting all the TV Century 21s that had the Dalek strip in it, and all the TV comics, which the 15 years worth of weekly comics, a phenomenal number of issues. And none of them had a complete collection, but what they were doing is they were all scanning the issues they had and adding them to the group. And so they were building up a complete set of Doctor Who comic strips, and they were very, very close to completion on them, and they were missing a number of the Countdown and TV Action issues. And I didn't have them myself at the time. I do now, but I didn't have them myself at the time. But a friend of mine had all those issues, and so what I did was I emailed him and said, "Can I borrow your collection? I need to scan some issues for the." And he very kindly let me do that. And so I started contributing to this group, and we got to the point where we were only missing 2 TV comic strips. We had everything else as a scan. And when I pitched the book to Telos, to David Howe and Stephen James Walker, I said to them, this is what I want to do. And they said, yes, go for it. And I said, one problem is I'm missing 2 of these comic strips. And I think Stephen James Walker said to me, I've got those, I'll email those to you. And so, okay, yes. Just the final bit of the puzzle clicked into place. I knew I was committed at that point. That's the moment I thought, if he can provide those, I'm going to go for it. So that was the sort of the confirmation, if you like. And I've since built up a fairly substantial collection, but what I did when I was writing the book is I spent a week in what I don't think it exists anymore, but there used to be a newspaper reading room in Hendon in London, and you could go in there and as a reading room and you put in your request, and so the people who work there have their trolleys and they go and wheel out these bound volumes of newspapers and magazines, and they had an archive of TV comic. And so I went in there and I requested these volumes, and they just brought them out one by one, and I'd sit there leafing through these dusty volumes for day on end, making notes, because what I wanted to find is when, I had the strips obviously scanned, so I didn't need to look at those, but was there any mention of the strip elsewhere in the issues? Did it appear on the cover, for instance? Were there letters to the editor? Were there, any other mentions of the comic strips? So that was fascinating. A lot of tedious work, but a lot of fun too. And the other thing with the comic strip companion, because when I originally set out to write it, it was just going to be a straightforward episode guide. I was going to basically summarize each story and provide a few continuity details and everything. And I thought, no, this is a bit dry. I need to review them as well. So I wrote a review for each story. Then as I was sort of getting close to completion, a good friend of mine who also works on the DVDs and Blu-rays, Richard Bignell, whom I'm sure you've heard of. Richard emailed me and goes, do you realise that the Caversham Written Archive Centre, the BBC one, has files of the correspondence with TV comic? And he very kindly scanned the complete files, and because I was back in New Zealand by this time, and emailed them to me. And I go, this is fantastic. So if you've read my book, you'll see that particularly for the 60s, there is so much correspondence about what the TV comic were allowed to do and what they weren't allowed to do.
Oh, absolutely.
It just...
Yeah, it's a fascinating extra dimension, isn't it?
Gosh, to me, it just makes the book come alive.
And explains a lot.
It makes the book come alive in a way it would have been a lot more drier without it.
Paul, just talk us through fandom in New Zealand briefly. Is there still a formal setup? What shape is it in?
This is the strange thing that I often ponder about with fandom in New Zealand. I don't know if it's the same overseas, but I ran the fan club when Doctor Who wasn't around.
Right, yeah.
I mean, the Doctor Who fan club came into existence during the McCoy era, the New Zealand fan club. And obviously it started to take off in a big way when the series went off air, and this sounds absurd, but really what it was is that people were missing the series. They wanted to hear when it was coming back, and this is before the internet, of course, so following a fanzine would help you to know if the news was going to come out. And obviously the New Adventures were taking off, and later Big Finish and all that sort of thing. So the fanzine in a way kept the series alive and kept the fan community active. And it became quite a big, thriving fan community by New Zealand standards. We were certainly, in terms of New Zealand fan clubs, we were for a long time one with the largest membership. out of all science fiction clubs in New Zealand. Once the series came back, the readership and the membership started to drop away, which sounds absurd. But really what it was is that because there was such a huge internet community and everything could be read, you could get your news instantly online by this time. And there were so many discussion groups and Instagram and Facebook and everything that people just didn't need a printed, photocopied fanzine anymore, and they didn't need a fan club to tell them about the series and everything. The hardcore readership obviously stayed on, but it just dwindled and dwindled to a point where it just wasn't sustainable anymore. So we wound up the fanzine and the club about 10 years ago because, like you mentioned, the website's still there and the fanzine articles are still there, but it hasn't been active for a very long time now. So it's almost like we kept the flame burning when there wasn't a series, and when it came back, it wasn't needed anymore.
It's developed yet again online, hasn't it? Because the forums, Gallifrey Base and elsewhere, they're in decline because there's an even more readily accessible news feed on Facebook or what have you.
You look at what's going on in Twitter, particularly say with Emily Cook doing the tweet-alongs.
Yeah.
That's where the community is probably at the moment.
Yeah, I'm a latter-day convert to attending the Fitzroy Tavern, and I've heard tale of these massive gatherings, and I go with Paul Morris and Richard and Giles and friends, and there's barely ever a dozen people there. Barely ever.
I was going to say, much of what you said is very similar to what happened here. But I've never quite understood why the pub gatherings would dry out. It's no pun intended, because it's not as if you can really move that online, can you? There's always going to be a certain dimension missing.
Sure.
Alcohol.
Well, we tried to do that in New Zealand. I certainly, when I went over to the UK a few times, I would go along to the Fitzroy and see that as it was. And because I was only going back once every few years, I was sort of snapshotting it in a way. I'd see one in 1998 where it was absolutely heaving.
Yeah.
And then say by 2002 it was slightly smaller. 2006 it was smaller again. By 2008 I turned up and I think there was one other fan there.
The fanzine culture survived slightly longer over here, almost entirely because of the Fitzroy Tavern, because there was physically a place to exchange them. So people just do it almost for a vanishingly small group of their own friends and turn up and swap fanzines.
I know it's different for you, but certainly the fanzines that I encountered at the Fitzroy were very sort of satirical, jokey fanzines, maybe. Very sort of,
Yes, I may have contributed to that
myself.
Oh,
no.
It's a bad habit, isn't it?
No criticism of it whatsoever. What I'm trying to say is that my fanzine, which develops at a time probably when I really wasn't that exposed to fanzine culture, is much more... it's not an academic journal, but you know what I mean? It does take Doctor Who more seriously than that. It's much more research-based and review-based.
I'm glad people like you were out there too, to take it seriously back when there were still new facts to discover.
Sure. If I had done a humour zine, maybe I never would have got the work on the Blu-rays. So there are advantages to doing a serious fanzine, maybe.
Shall we talk about The Lion?
Oh, is that what we came here for? I've quite forgotten.
Can I ask, before we talk about it, Paul, I don't want you to review it by any means, but what were your preconceptions about the Crusade, or what's your opinion of the Crusade as a serial? Just very briefly.
I think my impressions of it are very much coloured by it being one of the first Target books I would have read, I think.
Yeah.
So my mental image of the Crusade to this day is very much the detail that David Whittaker put into the book, which, as we know from comparison now, is very much more action-based, and there's a lot more happening, particularly in the later episodes, than we actually got on screen. So yeah, it's hard to separate the two mentally. And as a fan growing up, forgive me, but when I was a younger fan, I tended to be very dismissive of the black and white stuff. If what I had seen of it was very little, and what I had seen was multi-generation tape, so it was quite hard to watch. A lot of snowstorm, a flickering picture that never quite settled down back in the VHS days. So, obviously I've long since sort of learned the wisdom, the error of my ways, if you know what I mean, become a reformed fan of the 60s stuff, so don't get me wrong on that. But there would have been a time when the historical stories in particular I would not have paid any attention to whatsoever. So Crusade really didn't figure on my radar very much up until the time when we found it, because I wasn't someone who looked for missing episodes. You know what I mean? I didn't have any expectation we'd ever find anything in New Zealand, so I wasn't actively looking at any point, and so I never was sort of running through my head, oh, what if we found this, what if we found that. That just wasn't part of my mindset. So yeah, I didn't really have much impression of the Crusade. It was just another entry in the program guide.
I think ostensibly because there are no monsters, it's a historical, it's quite wordy. I don't think it would have been popular with the kids at the time, and you know, it was the last historical of its type, and they were abandoned after that.
The Hartnell Years was out on VHS, and that had the episode 3 on it, Wheel of Fortune. So I was familiar with that episode, but in terms of rewatching Doctor Who, I think I gravitated to the complete stories far more than the incomplete story. So if I was going to watch a Hartnell, I'm much more likely to say have watched Dalek Invasion of Earth or the Romans, or you know what I mean, the Time Meddler, anything that existed as a complete story that I can enjoy from beginning to end without having to resort to audio or reconstructions or what have you. So yeah, the Crusade really didn't figure on my radar very much.
So yeah, we're on to the third missing story. This, along with Marco Polo Reign of Terror, the negatives weren't kept, which they had been for most of seasons 1 and 2. Opinions still differ on why those 3 stories missed out. There used to be all sorts of discussion of the fact that perhaps because they were historicals, they weren't as desired or as much of interest in certain territories, so they weren't sold as widely.
Yeah, or rejected.
Yeah, well, indeed. Yes, the number of countries the Crusade was sold to has dropped yet again. It dropped from Marco Polo to Reign of Terror. Now we're almost at half the number of countries buying this as we had with Marco Polo. And as you say, not all of them showed it, including New Zealand. Paul, you know, you are the only person who's seen evidence that this story was rated. Was it Y?
Yeah, we've tracked down the original New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation, as it was at the time, the records that they had, the program logs, if you like, which was a handwritten ledger, multi-volume thing of every television program that came in as a film print into their archives. It has the record of it when it arrived in the archives, when it was scheduled for broadcast, because New Zealand was split into 4 television stations regionally at the time. So you got each of the 4 broadcast dates for each story, each episode rather, and then you've got, quite crucially, you've got the record of when it was sent away again, or what happened to the episode, and also what it was rated. So the New Zealand rating system at the time, obviously every episode had to be checked by the censor and approved or disapproved. G was the general rating, obviously, which meant it could be screened any time of the day, and Y was more of a sort of a young adult rating, which was, I think, from memory, had to be 7:30 or later in the evening, which obviously they wanted Doctor Who as a family program to be screened on a G slot, ideally. And on these ledgers that I just talked about, the line is actually logged as G along with the rest of the story, but on the actual film can itself it was Y, which meant it would have probably been rejected because it wasn't suitable for screening in that general family slot. So they probably would have gone no. The same way that other stories at the time were because Web Planet was rejected for it was a Y.
Astonishing.
From a 60s censor point of view, the Web Planet is a story that has no human characters other than the TARDIS crew. It's these alien creatures on this planet, and they probably thought for a general audience it isn't quite. It's a little bit alarming. And the same with Dalek Invasion of Earth, because Dalek Invasion of Earth's got some sort of scenes of violence and dead bodies and everything. You can see the reasoning from a 60s viewpoint. If you put that sort of mindset on of something that's very much more of a conservative viewpoint of how audiences reacted to television in the 1960s, you can see their reasoning. But what we don't know is why the Crusade wasn't screened, because we've got these 2 conflicting records. Our suspicion is that the annotation in the ledger is wrong and it should have been a Y, or that it was originally rated G and then someone had a rethink and gone, no, there's a little bit too much sword fighting and violence in this one, it probably should be a Y.
There's some very adult material with Ella Keir, isn't there? You know, threats of rape and
that's right,
and all that sort
that's
of
right
stuff.
But then by the same token, the Time Meddler screened here, and that's got, you know, threats of rape in it too. So
yeah. Jumping in just quickly on a point you made, you said there were 4 regions. Did they bicycle around the same print?
Yes,
From station to station?
No, they never screened on the same day. So you would have 4 regions were Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch and Dunedin, which were the 4 main centres in New Zealand. And there was no particular order. Usually it was, say, Wellington or Christchurch that got them first. Christchurch was the very first region to screen Doctor Who. And as a side note, we were the very first country outside the UK to screen Doctor Who in the entire world. So New Zealand has that claim to fame. But if a story stays screened in Christchurch, it may then screen in Wellington a week later, Auckland, say, a couple of weeks after that, and Dunedin maybe a week after that. So the closest an episode would ever screen in New Zealand would be in a space of 4 weeks. And yes, it would literally be put on a train or a truck or something, and as you say, bicycle. There'll be one film print. One film print would come into New Zealand. That film print would be physically edited. If any cuts were needed, they would actually physically snip that film. They would probably put their own NZBC leader on the front of it, and then it would just be shunted around the country to each of the 4 stations, screened as scheduled, and then it would go into storage in New Zealand until such time as a decision was made about what to do with that film print. And that's what happened with all the 1960s film prints of Doctor Who. So in terms of New Zealand, there's a large number of stories that never screened here. We never got, for instance, Keys of Marinus, Aztecs, Dalek Invasion of Earth, Web Planet, as I mentioned before. We never got Dalek Master Plan, never got Mission to the Unknown, never got Gunfighters, a whole swag of Troughton. We never got season 6 of Troughton at all. Wheel in Space was the last story screened here prior to Pertwee. And some of those stories we just never purchased. It's not that they were all rejected by the censor. Some of them just never arrived in New Zealand. They probably perhaps were not offered for sale, or if they were offered, they were just turned down for sale. Yeah, there's big gaps in the New Zealand broadcast record. The complete stories, the stories that exist to this day, have since been repeated here. We've been very lucky that from the 80s onwards that a lot of stories have been repeated. So if a story exists, I mean, there's a between when the UK screens Keys of Marinus and when New Zealand screens Keys of Marinus, there's about a 36-year gap. So we had a little bit of a wait for that story. But yeah,
it didn't improve.
With the Pertwee era, we had the same problem. We never saw any of the Roger Delgado master stories on the first run through. There were only 10 Pertwee stories screened, and then they went on to Tom Baker. So yeah, it was a very, very piecemeal. Yeah, so Crusade was one of those ones that fell through the gap and never screened here. So it's ironic in a way that it turned up here.
I've been looking into trying to discover, well, seeing what the consensus of opinion is on where your prints came from in New Zealand, and even John Preddle doesn't seem particularly clear. I'd assume that they would have come directly from the BBC, as they did for Australia, that you would have had nice new prints, but he seems to think that a lot of them came via Singapore.
Yeah, unfortunately, that ledger that I mentioned states where they went. It doesn't state where they came from. So we know, for instance, which episodes went from New Zealand to, say, Iran, or to Denmark, or to Singapore, which were the 3 main countries that we exported films to, but we don't necessarily know where they came from. Some of the, and this comes from John, so this is his research, but some of the episodes that were screened here in the 60s definitely came from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the ABC. But then, because of the dates, we know that some of them can't have done, because if the ABC only had 1 film print and we were screening at the same time they were, there had to have been 2 film prints, and where did we get ours from? So maybe we got a mixture of ones from the ABC and maybe some directly from the BBC, and who knows, maybe some from other countries. There was certainly a lot of bicycling going on, and that really muddies the waters in terms of knowing how many film prints were struck in the first place if countries were sharing them around.
You mentioned Iran. That's quite timely, isn't it? Because no less an authority than Mr. Venesis has suggested that 2 episodes at least might still be there.
We know from the program logs that I believe it's 2 episodes of Marco Polo, the first 2 episodes of Marco Polo were sent to Iran. Why we didn't send the complete story, I don't know. Is it simply that the ledger hasn't been filled in for those other episodes and we sent the complete story? Or was it that we only sent the first 2 episodes because that's all they wanted? I don't know. Did they ever screen it as well? That's the other question.
It would seem odd to send 2 on an audition principle, because you'd have to then marry it up with the next 5 if they wanted to option
it. It does seem odd, doesn't it, that you'd audition 2 episodes and not the rest of the story? Because what if you said, oh, we like that, we'll get the rest of it, and then there was something that we really couldn't screen in the rest of the story you'd really want to watch? the whole thing, surely.
Yeah.
So, yes, your episodes were sourced from a variety of different places, but some of them were sent on as well to other countries. But the ones that weren't all faced the same fate, didn't they?
Yeah, on the program logs, there's a date against many of the episodes of the 1st of April 1970. And for a while we wondered what that was, and it turned out to be a stock take date. And simply what it was is that someone or a group of people had gone through the New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation film stores and made a note of which film store had which film prints sitting on the shelves on that date, so that they therefore had an up-to-date record of what they were holding, and so they knew, because days before computers it was all done on pencil and paper. So the annotation against that episode of the Lion and the other episodes of the Crusade is HS 1470, which is Harriet Street, which was one of the New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation's film stores in Wellington, and obviously that date of 1st of April 1970. So that's the last annotation for that film print. And what we know anecdotally is that subsequently to that, a large number of those episodes that were in that stock take were sent to the dump. They cleared out the film store. New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation were building new archives, new studios, and didn't want to necessarily keep everything they had in the old film store. So a lot of it was just relegated to landfill, to be sent to the dump. So we're talking, this is by no means just Doctor Who, it's by no means just BBC material, it's just film cans from all over the world that they happen to have brought into New Zealand for screening on television. They were just loaded onto trucks and sent to landfill.
Do you have a view as to why those films weren't sent back or destroyed? Obviously they were destroyed because of the reasons you're saying for the change of premises, but there's this notorious return or destroy instruction, isn't there, that goes out with BBC prints?
There would be a cost associated with returning them to the other side of the world.
Sure.
We know that a large number of Doctor Who film prints, and presumably other television programs as well, were sent on to other countries. So it probably would have been a sense of just letting other countries know what they had, and other countries would say, oh, we don't need that, or we would like that, please. And it just simply happened to be that the Crusade, along with a number of other stories, the episodes were not requested by any other country. They were not needed by Singapore, for instance.
I just wonder if they were still for sale, if the rights had expired by 1970.
I think some of them had, but certainly wasn't Ethiopia still buying some of these things back catalogue?
Yeah. Ethiopia is the last record of the Crusade being bought by a country, and that's 1971. So it's well after New Zealand acquired it.
It doesn't always seem like this bicycling system is working like a well-oiled machine, does it? I mean, just last time on the Reign of Terror, we were talking about Paul Vanezis' theory that prints were often sat in, he used the word, not us, in little hubs, one of which may have been Cyprus, and that countries would put the word out on the network that they wanted a story, and it wouldn't necessarily be controlled centrally from the BBC.
And what would this network have looked like? Are we talking telex machines? Are we talking faxes? Are we talking actually physically mailing a catalogue to people? I mean, this is long before internet.
We were discussing the fact that he when he brought this up in the only time he's brought it up in an interview, he seemed very sure of it on very little evidence. So I think he must have seen something that we're not privy to.
I often draw the distinction in the approaches of John Preddle and Richard Molesworth to Phil Morris and Paul Vanezis when they're talking about stuff, because John's is very scientific and he will come up with an explanation for why certain prints were sent where based on where they weren't broadcast or were broadcast, and it's very watertight, and it's much the same in Wiped. But you listen to Paul and Phil talking about it, and they're saying it's balmy, it's all over the place. There's no rhyme nor reason. Things were just bunged in a crate and sent all over the world. It's really interesting that there are these two different theories about what happened.
Maybe the truth's halfway between the two.
Maybe it is. Yeah.
And to bring it back to the story in question, I mean, New Zealand presumably didn't check to see whether or not the Crusade was still on offer before deciding unilaterally to destroy it. So
they might have done. They might have sent a list of, and we're not just talking Doctor Who here, of course, but they might have sent a list to the BBC and said, do you actually want any of these? We'll send them back if you want them. There are records of some of the Troughton stories that the NZBC were holding were sent back to the BBC.
Yeah.
I think the Ice Warriors has got an annotation of return to London BBC. So yes, they were prepared to send stuff back. It's just simply some of it wasn't. And you've got to bear in mind too, at the time when the BBC dumped those stories, the BBC might have still held a copy. Is that possible?
This is true.
So the BBC response might have been, oh no, we've got the Crusade, we don't need it.
And without wishing to open another can of worms, Ethiopia did, when they bought those stories the year after, they did get them from countries which were part of the TIE and distribution network. So there may well have been wheels within wheels.
Anyway, cut to 1999, and 29 years after it was dumped
It's such a long time,
on
isn't
landfill.
it? Such a long time for it to be effectively hidden from public view.
Yeah. What happened? Tell us what happened. Is that too broad a question?
We probably need to break the story down
What
a bit.
happened?
But yeah, it starts out as sort of word of mouth thing. And here I have to give a lot of credit to my good friend Neil Lambis, who's the one who did all the detective work. And he was talking to a friend of his called Cornelius Stone, who again never really gets mentioned in the story. So really a shout out to Cornelius here for his part to play as well. Cornelius was a friend of a film collector called Bruce Grenville. And Bruce had in his collection, in his house, a number of 16mm film prints that he would play for his friends. And he had like an amateur sort of cinema type organisation. You know, you could hire the films. He'd come along and play the films for you if you wanted. So he was offering a sort of a film hire service. This was actually online. You could this is the absurd thing. In 1998 on Bruce's website, which you could have viewed from UK or anywhere in the world, he had the line listed online. No one ever noticed.
Oh, it's bonkers, that, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's mad. Yeah.
Anyway, so getting back to the story, Cornelius had seen this episode of Doctor Who and mentioned it to Neil when they were chatting about what Cornelius had seen, because they were talking animated Planet of the Apes or whatever it was that Cornelius had also watched, and they were raving about, oh, isn't it great to see these things on film? So Cornelius mentioned that there was this Hartnell episode he'd also seen at Bruce's, and this obviously pricked Neil's ears up, because Neil is one of these people who has spent a lot of time speculating about Doctor Who episodes still surviving anywhere in the world, maybe New Zealand. And Neil's got a background as a film projectionist anyway, so he's got an actual interest in the subject. So Neil established from talking to Cornelius that it was an episode of the Crusade. They got that far, and the belief generally was that it might be the episode that existed on VHS. Cornelius thought it might have been the same one, so Wheel of Fortune, episode 3. But he wasn't sure. You know, so Neil's thinking, well, the other 3 episodes are missing, so, you know, got a 1 in 4 chance of it being the one that, you know, it would be ironic, wouldn't it, if we went along and it was Wheel of Fortune, and we go, oh, no, because it could have been.
But, yeah, a bit like later happened with the Space Pirates.
Well, exactly. So Neil got in contact with John Predel, whom we've already talked about, and said to John, you know, hey, there's a missing episode. And because myself and John had listened to Neil for many years talk about missing episodes in New Zealand and all these theories and everything, and I'm sure that at some point you'll have Neil on your podcast and Neil will tell you all his theories, so I don't need to go into them now. But there's a bit of a cry wolf situation there that, you know, Neil's expecting John to drive from another city to come back to Auckland and go with him to see this film collector on the off chance that he might have a missing episode. So John turned him down and said, no, you know, I don't think, I'm not bothered, I won't come along. So Neil then phoned me, and one of the reasons he did that was because John said, oh, Neil had already arranged for Bruce Grenville when he'd set up this meeting. He said, would you mind if we videoed the episode? You know, if we set up a video camera and took a recording of it off the screen. Bruce goes, no, that's fine, you can do that. And so I had a video camera and John didn't. So John said, why don't you call Paul, because he's got a video camera. And so Neil phones me in, and I go, oh, Neil, look, I haven't actually, you know, Neil's a good friend of mine, we've been friends for years, and I said, well, let's catch up anyway, because even if it turns out to be nothing, at least we'll have had a good catch up. And so, so we got together in town, we went out for a meal, and we, you know, there was certainly a sense of anticipation, or, you know, we could be on the verge of a major discovery, so we're getting quite excited about it. Really, we're sort of racking each other, okay, this is going to be great, we're going to find something. But the background mind's going, no, don't get too wound up, because, you know, this guy might not have anything that, you know, that's missing, or he might not have anything at all. The Chinese whispers might have got very confused. So we went along to the Bruce's place, and Bruce welcomed us in and everything, and very happy to see us there, and we chatted and everything. The problem was that Bruce had just maybe 10 minutes beforehand had sat down to watch a film on video.
I read this.
Yeah. It was a film called Veronica Voss, which is forever stuck in my memory. 1984 black and white film that just seemed to go on for an eternity. IMDb says it's under 2 hours, but it felt like 3 to me. So we basically had to very politely sit through this entire film, and as we were doing so, my feeling was that this is how you get wound up. This is how hoaxes happen.
Yeah.
You know, you've been pranked, basically. You get to the, you know, you've been waiting there all evening. Oh, we've got nothing, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've
Got a video of Rick Astley.
yeah,
on the end
you've
of
been
it.
had. Yeah, exactly. You've been rickrolled. You've been had. You know, someone jump out. You've been pranked. So that was my feeling of, you know, I was getting more and more despondent as we were watching. And I think Neil picked up on that, because at some point he sort of turned to me and goes, no, it'll be all right. Stick with it, you know. So very politely, because I didn't want to upset him or walk out on him or anything. We suffered through this film. And then afterwards, Bruce goes, it's getting quite late at night by this, so it's getting into, and I was saying, I was half expecting Bruce to go, oh, it's too late now, we'll do it another time. But no, Bruce goes, no, let's put on the film. Let's just do it. So we put on the film. Another thing to consider, and this is something that's only just occurred to me, when we got there, it was probably still daylight, and therefore actually putting the projector on might have been too early in terms of actually being able to see the film. That might have been,
right.
In Bruce's defence, that might have been part of his reasoning, although I don't remember him saying so at the time, is he might have been waiting for it to get dark so he could actually screen it. It's never occurred to me until I was telling you that right now. There you go, there's exclusive for you. So because this is January, right? And early January, this is New Zealand, so that's a height of summer for us. So it would have been getting dark about maybe 9 o'clock in the evening. There you go.
Yeah.
Gosh, that's a mystery solved, isn't it? That's why we were watching Veronica Voss on video. Because the Veronica Voss wasn't on the projector, it was on the video. You know, it was just on the television.
Well, there you go.
Oh, you see, I've been maligning Bruce all these years. Sorry, Bruce. Isn't that funny, all these years later, when you retell a story, how things occur to you?
But he could have put on Back to the Future or something, couldn't he?
Terrible. All those times I've told the story and grumbled about him, and oh dear, totally unjustified. I feel bad now. Anyway, get back to the story. So at the end of it, Bruce says, right, we'll set the projector up now, and you can set your video camera up and we'll play the episode for you. And at this point, Neil and I are still very unsure about, obviously he's got a physical film print, that's pretty obvious, and it's probably Doctor Who, because why would he go to this effort if it wasn't? But we still don't know, you know, which episode it is. And Bruce says, I think it's called The Lion. And we're going, well, that's one of the missing ones. So we're kind of getting a little bit anticipation at that point. And because the agreement we had with Bruce was simply, we'll come round, we'll watch it, we'll video it. And my video camera had an open mic, so obviously it's picking up all the sound in the room. We were like, we'll just all stay very quiet and watch it so that we get a good copy on the video, right? So we were restrained in our reactions, obviously. So once Neil and I saw the beginning of the episode, and it started out, and we could see that it was the beginning of the story, and sure enough, there was the title, The Lion. We were kind of like silently shaking each other's hand and sort of giving a thumbs up and everything, without wanting to say anything. I mean, that sounds really absurd, I guess, in retrospect, because, you know, we should have been sort of cheering and whooping and carrying on. What we didn't know, because neither of us knew Bruce very well, is whether that might have been our one and only opportunity ever to see it. And so therefore that video copy that I was making on my video camera might have been the only record we ever had. So there is a parallel reality where to this day that video camera recording is what everyone's seen and nothing more. If Bruce, for argument's sake, never let it out of his sight, or sold it to a collector who never let anyone ever see it ever again. So so we were mindful at the time that we needed to get as good a video copy as we could of the, you know, and it's simply a video camera pointed at a projection screen on a slight angle, obviously, so it's not, you know, it's not dead on. Yeah. And obviously the sound of the projector clicking away alongside it is also on the soundtrack. So it's honestly, it would not have been BBC standard to put it out. It would have been like a hidden Easter egg if it had gone out on
Yeah.
on Blu-ray or whatever. So obviously we got to the end of
I was
it.
just going to say that, actually. Have you still got it? I mean, maybe it could make a good hidden Easter egg when we
Yeah,
finally
I
get
mean,
to...
when they eventually get round to putting out that season, maybe I should suggest that to them. They should put out the... I know that I sent a copy... I'm getting ahead of myself, but I did send a copy of that VHS to Steve Roberts, so he may still have that somewhere. I'm not sure if I've still got a copy. But yeah, it'd be funny to see it, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So we got to the end of the episode, and the awkward thing was that on one hand... And, you know, you mentally play this through in your head. In fact, the thing is, when I was watching the episode, I was trying to enjoy it and, you know, take an experience, but like you would be. And the back of your mind is going, what do we do now? You know, that's what was on going through my head. What do we do now? We haven't really discussed this very well beforehand. How do we cope? What do we do? We don't know what the correct procedure is to actually do anything about this. Well, who is this guy? Is he going to let us borrow it? You know, all this is running through my head while we were watching this episode. So we get to the end of it, and I was really hoping that Neil wouldn't overplay his hand, and he probably was hoping the same thing about me, because we hadn't really discussed it very well beforehand. Because if we'd suddenly started saying to Bruce, this is fantastic, you're sitting on a gold mine, Bruce might have gone, oh, okay, right, I'm putting it up for auction right now, and no one's ever going to get to see it, and I'm going to make millions of dollars out of it, or whatever he thought. And that would have been the end of it. As it was, Bruce was kind of like, it doesn't really... I've watched it a number of times. I'm not really that interested in it. You know, it's not a complete story. In Bruce's mind, he thought the BBC held it. He didn't realise it was a missing episode. He wasn't much of a Doctor Who fan himself, so he just wasn't clued up on the fact that the BBC were missing. You know, his immediate reaction to us saying to him that the BBC were missing episodes, and this was one of them, was, you know, that's not right. The BBC hold all of Doctor Who. You know, you can go into a shop and you can buy them in VHS. We'll go, no, there's ones that are missing. But this is a non-fan perspective, right?
Also, a lot of BBC staff thought exactly the same thing, apparently.
Well, we'll get to that later on, shall we? That's a whole other can of worms.
Did you tell Bruce there and then, or did you go, oh, well, that's quite interesting, I suppose? Or how did you react when the film finished?
Well, like I say, we were trying to be a bit sort of diplomatic and circumspect about it, because we didn't want to sort of hype Bruce up to the point where we didn't want to think he had something so incredibly valuable that he would never let out of his sight, because my objective in this was, I want to actually borrow this film print from you. I want to take it away with me. I want to send it to the BBC. I want them to be able to take a copy of it, and then my presumption was, then they'll give it back to you and you can do what you like. That's what I proposed to Bruce at the time. I said, look, this would be the ideal situation if you let us borrow it and send it to the BBC for a period of time as a loan. Bruce seemed amenable to this, but he wanted time to think about it, because obviously he didn't know us very well, we didn't know him very well, he didn't know if we didn't have any sort of credentials on us or anything, if you know what I mean. So we decided to leave it for a week, you know, let Bruce think about it. Neil and I went back to my place and we emailed Steve Roberts. I knew Steve probably through his forum, maybe, so he knew who I was. He knew, you know, we knew each other to email each other. So his reaction was very much immediately, great, this is great news type thing. And he emailed me a letter that I could give to Bruce that would, you know, state what the BBC's intentions were in regard to the film, so that Bruce had something to, you know, verify that we were legit. And I think that happened. I might be getting ahead of myself. That the first time I think I didn't have the letter when I went around to see Bruce, if I remember rightly, because I rang up Bruce. Neil had to go home to his own city, so I had to do all the leg work after this point. So Neil had done all the detective work. Neil had invited me along. Everything in terms of finding the film, in terms of finding Bruce, arranging the film, you know, the screening, actually getting in contact with Bruce, doing all that legwork, inviting me along, that's all Neil. Neil deserves all the credit for that. That's Neil is the one who found the film. I'm the one who returned it, if you want to break down the responsibilities there. So this is where I come into play, is I was responsible for negotiating its return once Neil had gone home to his home city of Whangarei. And so I rang up Bruce a couple of days later and said, I didn't leave a week because I thought someone's going to hear, we're going to lose our opportunity. So I rang up Bruce and I said, look, you know, hello, remember me and all this, and thank you so much for letting us see the episode. how do you feel about loaning it to the BBC? Would you mind if I come around and pick it up? And he goes, oh yeah, come around in the evening. So I thought, this is easy. So I thought, right. Well, I drove around to Bruce's after work and go, right, hi, here I am. And Bruce meets me at the door, goes, no, I've changed my mind.
Oh no!
I've decided that I don't. You might take the film away, and I might never see it again, and I'll never know. I never hear any contact from you, and I've lost my film type things. Fair enough, Bruce. You don't know me very well, and I could just be trying to steal your film. So I think at that point I went back to Steve and got an official letter from Steve emailed through that I could print out and send and give to Bruce. So I think that was the point at which it turned from, I got some backing, if you like. Because the second time I went back to Bruce, he looked that over and said, yeah, that's fine, and handed me the film.
Fantastic.
But the thing that sticks in my mind to this day is walking away from Bruce's flat with the film in my hand, and it was a very long, steep driveway that I had to walk up, and Bruce was standing at the door watching me. I just kept thinking at the back of my mind, any moment now he's going to go, hold on, no, wait, come back, I've changed my mind. I just thought, this is just, get to the car, get in the car, drive away. But yeah, I was in constant contact with Steve, and Steve said, look, the best way to get this film back to me securely is if it goes directly to Steve's address, not to the BBC. Because if it goes through their mail room, there's the risk that it might go to the wrong department, might get missing. There was also, I don't know how true this was, the belief too that there were fans working at the BBC who might have intercepted it before it got to Steve. That was never been confirmed for me, but there was certainly people have posited that as being a reason why it shouldn't have gone directly to the BBC. Anyway, I arranged all that with Steve, and I'd already posted Steve a copy of the VHS. So that he could, because at a point when we didn't know if we could borrow the film, so at least he had a copy. And then Steve said, look, the most secure way is to use FedEx to get it from New Zealand to the UK. I go, Steve, you realise how much money this is? He goes, that's all right. You'll be reimbursed by the BBC because they want to get this back. I hear you laughing already, you know this, but anyway, right. So I dutifully do all this, and out of my own pocket, own Visa card, send the film print via Express FedEx to the UK, and it's so fast that Steve receives it long before he gets the VHS copy, even though they've been posted earlier. And so that's all secure. He's got the film. The film's fine. Brilliant. Everything's good. So from that point, I can sort of breathe a sigh of relief. So yeah, I mean, as you're probably aware from seeing the film, it wasn't in the best of condition. There was a lot of tramline marks down the side where it had slipped off the projector reel, and obviously the edge of the film had become scratched over time. That's possibly partly due to Bruce screening it quite a few times prior to that. He'd watched it a lot of times for playing it for his friends over the years. Well, I say over the years, over the months. He'd only had it since, and this is probably where we should talk about where it came from, really. But Bruce acquired the film in 1998, so only about 6 months before we found it in his possession. And Bruce had found it at a film fair in New Zealand. He'd bought it for a grand total of $5, which is next to nothing. And it just basically, the reason why it was so cheap was because it wasn't a complete story. It was, no one realised it was a missing episode. None of these film collectors had any idea that there were missing episodes of Doctor Who. And in the time after the discovery, after we returned to the BBC and we were like going, well, where did this come from? We realised it was originally a New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation print. There was, markings on the film can or the film itself which identified that. There was no doubt about that. It had the code number on it, which is a B-271-48. 271 is the New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation code for Doctor Who. B is the code for a half-hour program, and 48 was literally the 48th episode of Doctor Who that they had acquired. And the research that we did after the film was returned to the BBC, a good friend of ours from Wellington called Graham Howard did a lot of this footwork. He had discovered what had happened was that when the films, and we're talking lots of films here, not necessarily all Doctor Who, but films from this film store in Harriet Street that I told you before, had been sent to the dump, maybe multiple trucks, maybe multiple dumpings, not necessarily all on the same day. A film collector had got wind of this and had made arrangements with the guy who was doing the dumping that he would just, on the sly, would just help himself to, rather than this guy putting them all in the dump, he'd turn up with his van and he'd load a number of these film prints into the back of his van, and I don't know, maybe there was an exchange of money, I don't know. The details are too long lost in the past. But the reality was that quite a large number of film prints ended up in the film collector's possession, which were meant to have gone to the dump, and the paperwork was basically, they've gone to the dump. The guy who was dumping them was like, yeah, they all went in the dump. That's the official story, but the unofficial story is a lot of them went to this collection. This was a fraction of the dumping. So in other words, he wasn't allowed to take everything because, the guy had to have been seen to have dumped a lot of the stuff in the landfill. If the landfill didn't have any film pans in it, questions might have been asked.
He saved hundreds of prints, didn't he? But was that out of thousands, do you think, maybe?
We don't know quite how many there would have been. Like I say, there might have been multiple trucks worth. He took 321 films.
Right.
We know this because he produced a 17-page type list of all the films that he'd rescued from the dump. So we know what he rescued. There's like episodes of Man from Atlantis and Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea and all sorts of things. It's totally random because he was just basically probably at some haste and, covertness, shall we say, just grabbing what he could find. And I don't know if he would have even been looking out for anything in particular. So it's very much a random assortment of stuff. And unfortunately, we can do the mind games, but there could have been lots and lots of Doctor Who episodes in that dump. There could have been, the truck could have been dumping lots and lots of film prints of Doctor Who. It just so happened that one of them got picked up by this guy and taken, and that happened to be the Lion. None of the other film prints on his listing were Doctor Who, only that one print.
It's a remarkable coincidence, not coincidence, it's a remarkable stroke of luck that if the New Zealand records don't exist for what happened to the prints of the Dalek invasion of Earth, the Rescue, the Romans, the Web Planet, and the Crusade, what a good stroke of luck it is that the one episode that he has picked up is one of the 6, 8, 12, 18, plus 1 Crusade, 19 potential ones that he could have grabbed that we had. What a good stroke of luck. The same
annotation that appears on the program records for the Crusade, this 1970, the last known stock take of it.
Yeah.
Also on that is Dark Invasion of Earth, the Rescue, the Romans, the Web Planet. They've all got that same annotation against it, so they could potentially have all been in that dumping. Also in that is 5 episodes of Marco Polo. That also has the same annotation against it, because the first 2 episodes are sent to Iran, the remaining 5 have got the same annotation that Crusade has. So technically,
I did not know that.
Technically, they could have been in that dump. Same thing with Space Museum, but again, you're not that interested in that. But I'm saying there's the whole grouping of those episodes have all got that same notation against them. Yeah. But my point of all those stories that it's listed off to you, so many of those we don't need. You know what I mean?
Yes,
so let's imagine that all those episodes of Dalek Invasion of Earth, Rescue, Romans, Web Planet, all went into that dump at the same time. We don't know that, but let's say for argument's sake they did. He could have easily just picked out one of those. You know what I mean? The chance of him getting just the episode of Crusade, one that we didn't have, quite remarkable, really.
And it's a stroke of fortune as well, I think. We know definitively, thanks to the detective work, the films that he picked up. So you guys aren't going to be, wondering if there's more out there for the rest of your days, because definitively that's the only one he got.
Yeah.
It's sad.
Short of digging up this rubbish tip, there's nothing else that can be done, is there?
Yeah, but can you imagine? Not early 1970s through to now, what the sort of state of anything would be. I very much doubt you'd even recognise it as a film can, let alone anything else.
Even before Indiana Morris started talking about digging up rubbish tips, I remember fans on forums saying, could we do this? Could we do this? I'm sure somebody once said that it had a school playing field on top of it now, but I don't know if that's apocryphal.
Right.
John might have said it was a car park.
Yes, John Prettle's shown me aerial photographs of what he believes is the landfill area. Again, that's something maybe you can ask him about.
Yeah, fantastic.
Well, I don't want to fuel speculation by any means, but what we don't know is whether there are other film collectors who are doing the same thing.
Right.
So are there other collectors who have also got stashes of episodes that they rescue from dumps. And I'm not talking about digging up, I'm talking about, intercepting them at the point
Yes,
where they
indeed.
were taking them off the truck and basically saying, I'll have these things.
Yeah.
Because if one collector was doing it, presumably he was part of a community of collectors, and they may have all been at it.
Yeah.
Again, there's that high probability that there's no Doctor Who, and because, like I say, it was out of those 371 or whatever it was, there's only one Doctor Who, which just gives you an indication of just how many television programs were being dumped. And of those, you've got to remember, a lot of the Doctor Who episodes, missing episodes that now are not ones that New Zealand kept. A lot we sent on to Singapore, so they're just not around here in they couldn't be found. There's stories we know we cannot find because there's only one film print and we know where it went. So but
even so, fantastic that you've got the audit trail, if you like. The trail, because all of these orphans that have turned up in the UK, they've been on they've just turned up from a collector who can't really remember where they got them from, and if they got them from a car boot sale decades ago, then there's absolutely no chance of tracing it. It's such a complete story, this. It's lovely. It's really nice.
I mean, just
really good.
What we understand is that a large number of these film cans, including the Lion, had been stored for a long time on a property, and basically he hadn't been paying for he had been using someone else's property to store these films, and he'd agreed to pay this guy who owned the property for the storage space, and tons and tons of boxes and crates of all sorts of junk that was being, and apparently it was being exposed to the weather and everything, so it was all starting to deteriorate. So again, stroke of fortune, the Lion didn't, the rain didn't get in and all that sort of thing, because all these film cans were just lying around in open weather. So a guy called Dean Fletcher got sick of all these, having to store this stuff for his mate, and invited a film collector called Larry Duggan along to his property and go, well, do you want to just make me an offer for what you'd like? And so Larry bought around 40 of these films for $150, and one of those happened to be The Lion, and then Larry sold it at a film collector's fair. So Larry bought it in 1998, so it wasn't very much longer, and then May that year he sold it on at a film collectors convention in Napier, and that's where Bruce bought it. So basically the Lion had been sitting in junk storage for a while.
Fantastic.
So there's all this sort of good fortune steps all along the way where it might have got destroyed or lost or you know what I mean? It survived all these steps. And like I say, none of these film collectors knew the importance of it. They were all just like, it's an incomplete Doctor Who story. Oh, we know Doctor Who. We know what Doctor Who is. So this whole film collectors community, the word had not got round that there were any missing episodes of Doctor Who. There's also a certain, and this might be the case overseas, it certainly was the case as we discovered when we were doing this research, doors tend to slam shut very quickly when you make phone calls and letters to these film collectors, because there's an element of paranoia about film prints that they're holding that they know damn well they've got by less than entirely illegal means. And also too, Neil's told me this, I don't know this firsthand, but Neil's told me that in the 1970s there were certainly raids on film collectors' collections in terms of...
Oh, really?
Yeah, in New Zealand.
Because over here it's always the Bob Monkhouse incident that apparently reverberates through the decades, but you had the same sort of thing.
So there's a lot of paranoia and a lot of unwillingness to talk or tell people what they have. And we got the vibe that there was a very strong feeling that Bruce should not have come forward, should not have let anyone know he had this film, and that he should not have let it out, should not have gone public with it, should have kept it himself type thing. It was like, this is a closed community, we do not talk. It's a bit like Fight Club, really, isn't it?
Was there a degree of ostracization from his...
Yeah, I mean, there were
club?
actual moves by the Film Collectors Club that he was part of to actually have him struck off because of his action, which seems it seems ridiculous. And it's only because I believe, if I got it right, the president of the film club sided with Bruce and said, no, look, this guy's, he's done good for us. This is a feel-good story that because of our efforts that the BBC's got a film back that they didn't have. We should be celebrating this, not censuring him. So I think he survived that ousting because of the president backing him. But it sounds absurd, doesn't it?
So talking about the aftermath then, we've got as far as your film print closely followed by the VHS turning up on Steve Roberts's
Yeah, I mean,
doorstep.
then it's down to Steve working his magic, shall we say. The restoration team, as they were at the time, will put it through a wet gate process, I believe, to try and get as many of the scratches out. I mean, you've seen the condition of the thing on DVD. It's not the best quality, but they did the best they could. And I would hope now that time's moved on and software's improved, that when it does come out on Blu-ray, that a lot of those scratches may be able to be cleaned out. I'm not sure. I would hope that it'll look a lot more spruced up. But obviously they don't have the film print anymore. They've got the digital copy they made at the time because it was returned to Bruce.
Indeed. And nowadays, well, not that they've done them on Blu-ray yet, but they certainly have a practice of scanning things in HD now, don't they? Because I gather Mr. Crocker has said that even if there's no more resolution in the picture, you get more resolution in the damage, and that makes it easier to get the damage itself out.
Yes, when Bruce got the film back from Steve, it was about a month later, I think. I'd thought nothing of it. I kind of like, the film had gone back to the BBC, to Steve, and Steve had done all his work on it. And it's going, this is all good. And then Bruce contacted me a few weeks later and go, what's happened to my film? And so I got in touch with Steve and go, oh, yeah, we should return that, shouldn't we? So it's kind of like, so Steve FedExes it back to me and I return it to Bruce. Then Bruce goes on to do it, the first and only public screening of the film at a sci-fi convention in Auckland. It was very elaborately staged. Bruce was like, I want security guards. When I walk in, he wanted to be driven to the convention by security guards, and he wanted to be walked in flanked by these security guards, and he was going to put it on his projector and everything. So the convention were like rolling their eyes at this and going, "Oh, this is just ridiculous." So they what they did was they very cannily got a few of their friends who, the organisers' friends who happened to be quite solidly built characters to put on dark suits and sunglasses. And so Bruce was to be fair, Bruce was probably in on this, but he looked the part. You know what I mean? He wanted the showmanship of it. He wanted the theatrics of it. And Bruce's motivation behind doing all this was that Bruce wanted to auction off the film. Bruce believed by this point that he was going to make a hell of a lot of money out of it. He was talking at one point about buying a house out of the proceeds of selling the film.
Yeah, $1 million.
He sincerely believed this, and nothing I could say to him would do any different. When it went public, and I was interviewed by one of our newspapers, the very pushy reporter was like, how much is it worth? How much is it worth? And I just pluck a figure out of thin air. I said, it might be £1,000 maybe, I don't know. And so, of course, this went into print. Doctor Who print worth $1,000, it's like, well, I just speculated there. But Bruce was like on to me going, it's worth far more than that. You've really undervalued it. It's ridiculous. It's one of a kind. It's going to go for millions of pounds, and I'm going to make a lot of money out of it. Part of the problem was he was racked up by the Lottery Show in the UK, because they did a special episode which you might have seen of. They had Fraser Hines on it, and they were talking about good luck stories, and I think this is a segment they did every week on their Lottery Show, and they got Bruce on the show, a segment they filmed in New Zealand. He didn't travel over to the UK for it, but he's on the show talking about his amazing discovery and everything. And I think that the Lottery Show, because obviously they're associated with £1 million draws and everything, I think they just got cemented in Bruce's mind what an amazingly good fortune he had by owning this film print. So they probably racked him up to a certain extent in terms of making him think that he was sitting on this golden lottery ticket. And so he engaged an auction. He didn't go through eBay or anything. He engaged an auction house here in New Zealand to put it up for international auction at enormous marketing expense. And there were very few bids, and it didn't reach reserve, and it didn't sell. And then they tried again later, again at more additional marketing expense, and it did sell the second time, but unfortunately it didn't even recoup the costs that Bruce had outlaid in terms of the cut from the auction house, including the advertising they'd done into it. Although Bruce was not required to actually pay the difference, he certainly didn't make a cent out of it, which is kind of a bit unfortunate. So from thinking he had something that was going to buy him a house to something that made him absolutely nothing at all, it's a bit tragic, really. I did say, because obviously this is as much Neil's story as mine, that Neil really ought to be represented on this episode. What I asked Neil to do was to write me a couple of paragraphs that I could read out for you. This is Neil's perspective 21 years later on Finding the Lion. So if I can read this for you.
Please do, yeah.
21 years later, it still seems quite dreamlike to remember that night. The meal we had beforehand, the thought that it could have been a hoax played on us. The agonising wait as Bruce and his friend watched Veronica Voss. And then the unbelievable image of the opening titles on a big projector screen. Then the TARDIS materialising in the clearing, and the look on your face as we shook hands in silence, so as not to ruin what could have been the only recording you were making. Wow. But the best bit for me after all this time is still that letter Alvin Rakoff wrote, saying we had given him a little bit of his late wife Jacqueline Hill back for just 20 minutes. I still choke up about what he wrote, as it means the most to me. And for me, that's what matters most about finding any missing episode and getting it back. It restores the art, the work of people that tried to create something from virtually nothing, memories for those left behind, and maybe for those of us watching it for the very first time, or the 20th time. The fact that despite the wobbly sets, the black and white and the low budget effects, it's you and me, and all of us, with the Doctor and the TARDIS having an adventure. And once upon a time, 21 years ago, we saved the Doctor. Brilliant, Neil. Brilliant.
Hear, hear.
Absolutely fantastic.
Well done.
I hadn't heard about that Alvin Rakoff letter. That's amazing.
Yes.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Because people often talk about, when fantasizing about episodes coming back, saying it would be nice for so-and-so to see it and so on and so forth. But that's a really tangible piece of...
Years later, Fraser Hines came to New Zealand, and it was only about 5 years ago, I guess. Neil and I met him, and we explained who we were, and his eyes lit up and go, "Oh, you're the guys behind the lottery show thing I did." So yeah, it really meant a lot to him, and it meant a lot to Neil. Neil, a huge fan of Patrick Troughton and Fraser Hines. That's his era of Doctor Who, is the Troughton era. So to actually have Fraser recognise who Neil was really just blew Neil's mind. It's kind of like, this is just dream come true. But you can tell from Neil's words there just how, even all this time later, it means so much to him. It's just, it's the most important thing Neil's probably ever done in his entire life, probably. You know what I mean? It's just so important to him. And I'm sure, I really do hope you get the chance to talk to him, because he's got so many interesting stories to tell.
Yeah, well, hopefully, Neil, if you're listening, you'd be very welcome to come on, perhaps to tell us about the Macra Terror. So going back to the proposed Bruce auctioning off the print and having aspirations of 7 figures but achieving 3 figures, did he get a warning from the BBC or something about his ability to sell?
You're quite right. There's a whole issue around this. And in retrospect, looking back all this time later, I think the problem is that we were a test case, in the sense that prior to that time, you would have seen many articles in Doctor Who magazine. You'd have seen Doctor Who books. You'd have seen even like the documentary on the Weiss Warriors VHS, all talking about Doctor Who missing episodes, and all saying, if you ever find anything, the BBC would love to hear from you. That whole sort of ethos. If you think you've got a missing episode, please get in touch. We'd love to get them back. That was the message that was put out there. And so that was the general impression in fandom. If we found something, it should be returned to the BBC, because they'd love to have the episodes back and make the series that more complete. That's always been the understanding, and that's probably quite sincerely what everyone meant. But I think that prior, if I might get this right, prior to The Lion, I think that most, if not all, of the film prints that have been discovered came from television companies. Would I be right in thinking that? Certainly the find before that was Tomb of the Cybermen, which had come from Hong Kong, from the television station.
I think there were a handful that had come via
private hands.
collectors.
Yeah.
But I think there'd always been returned to the BBC via the sort of fans who had BBC contacts, who could smooth over that sort of issue.
Yeah. So this might have been the first time, for at least for quite a while, certainly maybe...
Something coming out of the blue.
Yeah, certainly in the last decade, prior to that time maybe, that an episode had turned up in private hands and therefore had to be negotiated in terms of getting it back to the BBC and all the ramifications around that. So Bruce, being his own publicist, if you like, wanting to create a big news story about it, was putting out press releases to all the major news organisations and getting a lot of newspaper coverage and media coverage. And as part of that, Bruce was saying in his press releases and everything that his intention was to auction off the film, which raised alarm bells at the BBC press office. Because, of course, from their point of view, he doesn't own the film. He can't sell off a episode of Doctor Who. He doesn't own it.
Yeah.
That was the official line. And so Steve was instructed to write to Bruce directly saying, look, you don't own the rights to this film. You can't auction it. You don't have... I don't remember the exact wording of the letter, but certainly it was a warning letter, basically saying, please cease and desist with these intention to make a lot of money out of this film print. And I guess too, there's also the thing that if that gets a lot of publicity, then it sets a precedent that any other film print had come to light. There would also be the expectation that this would also be a source of major revenue. So it would make the situation so much more difficult for the BBC to ever get anything else back. Yeah. So I could kind of see their reasoning, but it wasn't particularly, and it's not, can I just hasten to say, it's no criticism of Steve. He was, as a BBC employee, being told to communicate this information, so it's not Steve's words at all. Days later, the BBC had a change of heart and gone, no, hold on, this is going to backfire on us. We need to let Bruce know that while he doesn't own the copyright in the episode, he does indeed own the physical film print. That's his. So he can auction that.
What about that change of heart? Was it a result of any discussions with anybody involved?
It might have been Steve's input. I don't know. But there was certainly... Steve very urgently got in contact with me because by this time his letter was in the post to Bruce, the first letter, the warning letter. And so he said, look, can you just get in touch with, let Bruce know that, disregard the first letter, there's a second one coming. So Bruce was warned about this. Bruce knew to expect two letters. One letter saying, don't do anything, you're a naughty boy sort of thing. And the second letter saying, you're perfectly fine. Here are the legal things. You can auction your film, but you don't own the copyright. But Bruce obviously smelt a news story here, and so went to the papers. And when he got the first letter, and the Bruce, I'm being sued by the BBC. They're going to take me to court, but I'm going to get lawyers involved, and we're going to fight it all the way because totally unjust.
Yeah.
In the full knowledge, obviously, that the situation had been resolved. But this is Bruce wanting to drum up publicity for his auction. So my wider point is that the BBC were not set up. They were not prepared. They were not geared up. They didn't have a process, a policy, if you like. And of course, we're not just talking about Doctor Who here, because there are other programs, many other programs that they would like to have returned. And it was an interesting perspective. I got a phone call one day. This is maybe a couple of years after Return of the Lion and all the publicity had died down and everything. I got a phone call from a gentleman who was visiting New Zealand called Charles Garland. Now, this guy was a producer.
I know the name.
Right. Where do you know the name from?
Didn't he re-edit Dad's Army for afternoon repeats on BBC One?
You're quite right. So Charles Garland, he was on holiday in New Zealand, and because obviously he knew of my name, he looked me up in the phone book, and having a sufficiently unusual name, he was able to track me down and give me a call. So he was just saying, hello, and congratulating me on my part in returning the episode and everything, and it was very nice to hear from him and everything, and he was making the point that there were still episodes of Dad's Army that they were still looking for, so just like Doctor Who, that Dad's Army was incomplete and everything. We were chatting away, and a lovely guy and everything, had a nice conversation on the phone, and he said to me something which sticks in my mind to this day. He said, you are ever so fortunate that you got the episode back to the BBC. And I thought, this is an odd comment to make, so I questioned him. He said, you're going to be horrified to hear this, but the BBC receptionists, when they take calls from the public, they have a list of people they can forward them to, and these are all producers and production officers for current programs being made. There is nowhere to forward a call to if someone rings up and says, I think I've got a missing episode. So they basically say, they get turned away. They get told, sorry, we're not interested. It's not one of our current programs. And Charles Garland's perspective was someone might have had those missing episodes of Dad's Army that he was so desperately looking for and might have been turned away at the Switchboard. And he had anecdotal evidence from people who worked on the Switchboard, on the reception desk, that this was indeed the case for not people necessarily about Dad's Army, but people who thought they had missing episodes of any BBC program ringing up and, we don't have a number to forward you to, so we can't help you, sorry.
Flabbergasted.
Yeah. He was so upset about this, and so his point to me was, fantastic that you managed to get through the Switchboard. And I made the point, well, no, we didn't. We went through Steve Roberts. And he was going, fantastic. Fantastic that you found someone who cared. And I think that's all credit to the restoration team and Steve Roberts in particular, that we had that opportunity. Because if Neil and I had gone to the BBC, we might have, generally, if we'd gone and rang the main number, we might have had a hard time finding anyone. And I interviewed Stephen Cole a few years later, when he made a visit to New Zealand to publicise his children's books. And Steve Cole, as you might remember, used to be the brand manager of Doctor Who at the BBC at the time of the Lion's recovery. And Steve was equally horrified, but it backed up Charles Garland's story. He said, yes, that sounds entirely plausible that was happening at the BBC. But he was also very horrified that it happened. So that's just one example of, well, two examples, because there's the whole legal issue and also the Switchboard issue, of the BBC just not being set up for this sort of thing. One hopes that it's improved to this day, but I have this terrible feeling that if you did ring the BBC now on their general line, whether anyone would actually know what to do with a call like that, if that's still the case.
We heard the story of the Nigerian Television Authority ringing the BBC and wanting to return season 1 of Doctor Who, and they got told, no, it's okay, they're all on DVD, get rid.
Yeah, well, see, that's...
And that would have been about 99
and that's presumably through the main Switchboard and not through anyone who's actually clued up on.
That was alleged to have happened in about 1999, oddly enough,
right,
isn't it?
Sure.
And it didn't come to light for quite a while because, of course, how could it have done? The fact that it was never logged as a call at the BBC end or taken seriously is part of the problem.
Yeah, logged as a call at the Nigeria end. Yeah.
Yes, much better record keeping in Nigeria.
The other issue, which you're probably well aware of, is that the advantage with sending the film to Steve rather than to the BBC mailroom was that it was in safe hands. That Steve wasn't going to let it out of its sight, and it stayed with him, and no one was going to walk off with it. But the disadvantage of that is that I wasn't sending it back through official BBC channels, so there was no paperwork trail to show that I'd made that delivery, right? And so
right,
the process of me actually being able to claim back my expenses in terms of FedExing this film from one side of the world to the other was not straightforward. Steve put me in touch with the accounts department at the BBC for me to submit my expense claim, and it just sat there for months. We're talking after the thing's already out on VHS before I got any action. So the film's already making they're already making money on it.
Yeah. Wow.
And it literally got to the point where I was sort of going, I'm happy the film's back and everything. I'm not begrudging that, but it's kind of like, could you at least? I should say I didn't get paid a cent for the Lion. I didn't make any money. I never intended to. My thing was just get the film back. Everyone can enjoy it. Because I was thinking, well, that's all that matters to me as a fan. I'm not here to make any money.
But at the same time, you're not a charity.
There's one sure way to find out if they've improved their systems anyway, Paul, and that's for you to turn up the night of Jaffa Awards.
But the way I swung it in the end was to fax them a copy of my visa statement that showed the interest rate on it. And to basically put a covering note on it going, it's been 6 months.
What you've done is, change the landscape of that second series in a percentage minor way, but it's an experience altering thing that you've done for fans of the show. And
absolutely.
I hope all these negatives don't take away from the overwhelming positive that is there's a very fine episode of Doctor Who that sits in the archive thanks to Neil and yourself.
The point I really wanted to make there is not so much that I have all these gripes, although it does sound a bit like that, because I'm not bitter about it at all. It's simply that the amazement that what should have been a fairly straightforward process and should have been something that, in our expectation going into it, that the BBC would have been set up to embrace us with open arms and to say, hey, fantastic.
And as for your own recognition, I wouldn't be at all surprised if we get season 2 on Blu-ray within the next few years, and I'm sure your name will be all over it this time. I think the right people will be writing the sleeve notes and producing documentaries.
Well, it'd be lovely if I got to do the production information titles, wouldn't it? But who knows? I get told what I'm doing.
I'm going to take that as a hint, even though obviously...
No, good Lord, it's certainly not. No, I'm not winking or anything. Good Lord, I won't get in trouble.
No, I can assure you, Paul is not winking. They are apparently planning to carry on with the Blu-ray sets, and they're also planning to carry on with animations. So one way or the other, the Crusade will be coming to Blu-ray at some point.
Wouldn't it be lovely if they eventually do them all? You know, if there's a point where we can sit down and watch Doctor Who from the beginning, and all the episodes that don't exist we can have as animations. That would be brilliant.
I mean, over the last few years, they've been reticent about discussing. They've just taken it one at a time, and. But I was at the Gallifrey convention in February, and Russell, and I know Russell's only in charge of the Blu-ray range, not the animations, but I definitely heard it stated publicly that the aim was to try to do all of them.
I'm sure that's...
To try to do all the black and white, all the seasons, missing seasons on Blu-ray, all the stories and animations. We've heard various reasons put forward as to why certain stories might not be suitable. I mean, Charles Norton, who was previously producing animations, said he didn't think the Crusade was going to be possible because it had too many characters, it would be too expensive. But that was just his opinion, with his knowledge of the way the productions were being done a couple of years ago, and things move on.
Yeah, animation software becomes... I mean, I just look at the fact they're redoing Power of the Daleks now, because animation software has moved on, means that they can... And they've got more money and more equipment, that they can actually do a better job than they could, say, even a few years ago. So what's to say that in a few years' time that's the technical problems of stories like the Highlanders and the Crusade that they've said are too difficult won't become that much easier?
Yeah, specifically the Highlanders, they said, it was Charles's opinion personally that the tartan was too difficult, but they didn't. Yeah. They think that possibly things have moved on.
If they animated both Marco Polo and the Crusade, I mean, half the cast carries one to the other, so they get two for the price of one.
That's very true.
Because it's the economy of reusing the facial features, isn't it? Once they've got the kit set up for the character. Yeah. Which is why they're doing all the Troudens, because they've got Trouden nailed now. They can get good doing those.
So I'm thoroughly looking forward to that, because I think, as we've already said, it's one of my favourite stories. I think Tim feels the same, and yet I feel like it's still underrated by a large section of fandom. And I think if they could follow the story through, I think there's so much going on. It's such a condensed narrative that it's actually slightly difficult just going from episode 1 to 3 and missing part of the middle and the conclusion. Because certainly, I mean, back in the VHS days when you just had Ian Chesterton in his library briefly sketching in what we've missed, he does it very well, but goodness me, all that lovely dialogue you're missing and all those wonderful performances. So,
I mean, we take it for granted because we've had it for so long, but aren't we so blessed that we've got all these soundtracks for everything?
Oh, goodness me.
Oh, yeah.
There's a parallel reality where we're doing the animations, but no soundtracks were kept, so we're having to get a sound-alike cast in to, I don't know, maybe Big Finish is doing it or something, you know, where they're actually just having sound-alikes.
So, animation aside, there's also, always the vague possibility that we may yet recover the other two episodes. As we've said on the last two editions, the best hope for this story seems to be Ethiopia. There doesn't seem to be any other glaring opportunities, Tim.
No, indeed not. And, Ethiopia again.
Yeah, if they've got Marco, they've got Rain and Crusade. If they haven't, well, never mind.
And we'll never know in either case.
It's such a long time later, though, isn't it? It just decreases the possibility, I would have thought. Yeah,
a lot can happen in those...
it does.
40, 50, nearly 50 years.
I thought it was quite extraordinary when Web of Fear and Enemy of the World were returned. Again, they sat in that film store untouched for all those years. Okay? The chances of anything happening to them in all that time, and they've managed to survive that long. I thought it was so remarkable.
It was so obvious on the Enemy of the World special edition when we saw some of the photographs of that storeroom, was that it was an absolute time capsule. Yes. That room looked like it had been barred up for the majority of that time, and no one had gone in. And you have to wonder what the chances of those circumstances repeating themselves are. But you never know. I mean, Paul, you've had a hand in returning a film that was 1 out of 371 that just happened to have been fished
Yes.
out of a dump and then rescued as part of a larger collection furthermore, and then found its way to a person who knew the right person. I mean, these things
and
can
just
happen,
happened out of what was probably a large, if there was other Doctor Who episodes in there, almost all of the other ones in that batch were probably surviving ones.
Yeah. Yeah.
I talk about parallel worlds. There's a version where we found episode 2 of Dalek Invasion of Earth. You know, and
Yeah.
yay, we found a film from. Oh dear,
Yeah.
I'm sure I can still come on to talk to you about it, but no one will be that interested.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you'll come on and talk about a story in another capacity later on, perhaps,
I'd love
if
to.
you'd be game.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you both.
It's not contingent on you actually discovering it. We'll have you back just for the pleasure of your
I think
company.
you're waiting for me to find something else so I can come on and talk to you about it, right?
Quite right. Pull your finger out.
Thank you for negotiating this 11-hour time difference. I think it's been well worth
Quite
it.
all right.
Thank you.
And that concludes our review of the Crusade. And please join us next time when we'll be discussing the Time Meddler with another special guest. Lastly, I'm on Twitter at Doctor Who Podcasters with a DR. Paul's at Mr. Paul Morris, and we'd be delighted if you get in touch. Goodbye.